She left him with a broken heart and 10 small puppies wailing for companions who would console and care for them. Shook their heads pityingly, convinced that he couldn't bear the weight she had left behind. Yet 5 years later, when she eventually came back out of pure curiosity, she was astounded to learn how he had raised 10 puppies. Michael's day started like any other, except he was alone. And what unthinkable change had he experienced without her? Other with a calm at dawn, illuminating the simple house he and his spouse had constructed, but the silence was broken. When she declared that she could no longer support their frugal lifestyle or take on the responsibilities of 10. She was crying when the newborn puppies were abruptly left in their care. She left a surprised husband and a group of people behind as she left the house with just a small suitcase. The pathetic whimpers felt like a harsh and irreversible departure. In the days that followed, there were whispers in the neighborhood, and some people looked at Michael with sympathy. Off extra blankets or dog food donations. Others chit-chat about how long before he conceded defeat. He would have to decide whether to give the trash to a shelter or let them fend for themselves. Only one man, and now they claim that nobody can handle so many puppies. Small old house. Yet despite all the distressing rumors, Michael said nothing. Nobody really understood his determination to protect the 10 small lives entrusted to him. How much he had loved those pups from the beginning, and how the frail animals seemed like the last. He felt that by giving them away, he would be wiping out any remnants of a love that had disappeared from his home. As the days stretched into weeks, neighbors observed Michael's potential to save the life he had previously longed for. Weary look and the wrinkles of exhaustion on his forehead, but they also saw the unwavering determination in his eyes every time he came home carrying double-weight dog food bags or spent late at night mending his yard to establish a secure play space because the puppy's squeals occasionally tried his balance. Their near-constant need for food, cleanliness, and company, together with their ravenous need for attention, required almost all of his power, but a silent devotion blazed inside him with each shuddering puppy that it felt like a promise, a tiny glimmer of hope, to be held in his arms in spite of the grief and betrayal. There was still time to create a loving life, but the gossiping neighbors were unaware that Michael's refusing to give up those puppies would set him on a 5-year path of personal development, sacrifice, and remarkable success. A trip so profound that the scene that met his wife when she finally returned to town would leave her speechless. Speechless in the early days after his wife abruptly left. Michael's life was centered around a rigid, early every morning. He would struggle with feeding dishes and making formula for the puppy's needs-based schedule. Youngest and cooking meals appropriate for the older ones when they started to wean, even though they knew very little about canine development. He read through papers and videos, taking notes on basic veterinary knowledge and puppy feeding. He developed a cautious friendship with a compassionate veterinarian who worked at a little clinic on the opposite side of town, provided guidance on deworming, vaccines, and socializing. This was a far cry from he used to have a tidy, predictable life with his wife, one that was based on modest aspirations to accumulate money for a larger house. Perhaps having children one day might replace that future with insomnia, attempting to quiet squealing puppies at night, and everyday surprises like torn newspapers on the floor of the living room. But he, nevertheless, motivated by an unwavering desire to respect the helpless creatures entrusted to his care, his money never. Plenty to start with quickly decreased due to the strain of medical expenses and the constant hunger of 10 expanding dogs. Worked extra hours at the neighborhood hardware store, frequently staying late and going home on the tiniest days. He would see puppies running around the kitchen, bumping into one another for the first taste of. But when he filled their bowls, a tiny glimmer of interest appeared in his fatigue. His heart was filled with thankfulness for the puppies who were unaware of adult sadness. And treachery showered him with loving tail wags and yips whenever he showed around. Their naivete provided Strangely, the neighbors who watched reminded him that love and loyalty could still exist without any restrictions. A gruff senior called Carl was across the street when he hauled bags of dog kibble larger, and some babies' heads trembled. "Cal, you know another woman wheeling her stroller," and the street said, "You can't fix heartbreak with a pack of pups." Her eyes were clouded with sympathy every time Michael kindly volunteered to take in only a few of the puppies. Rejected. Perhaps he had become overly possessive of the small family that remained in his care. Whispered. But no matter how much they represented the only solace he had left in a life that had ripped apart. And as the weeks turned into months, the puppies began to exhibit clear. Among the characters was Juno, the daring adventurer who consistently climbed over the improvised hurdles. After Michael stood up, Melody appeared, her dejected, drooping eyes displaying a streak. This entailed gnawing on everything inside Odin. The youngest of the litter suffered from disease that needed close observation, each of which made a distinct demand on Michael's time, creating an unshakable emotional bond tied between him and every pup. But there were also joyful and bonding moments, and there was trouble around every corner. Several times, an unforeseen veterinary bill threatened to deplete Michael's finances, and his fatigue tugged at his. He was pallid after working double shifts, cleaning, grooming, and feeding Bones. Hollow-eyed, he lost weight, neglected to take a shower on some mornings, and almost gave up every time he thought of locating new homes for the puppies. He experienced a deep pang of guilt that forced him to return to his daily routine. Heartache. He firmly thought that he might be able to make things better if he could keep them secure and happy, vital to himself as well. And in the midst of his personal difficulties, a strange change occurred. Place among the neighbors despite the early rumors. Many of them started quietly supporting him one afternoon. On his doorstep, Michael discovered a basket of dog toys with no note. A friendly hang-in was written on the paper bag of homemade sandwiches that a neighbor placed at his door. Some were skeptical of his ability to run such an unusual household, while others were moved by the steadfast commitment they observed daily at one point, the hardware. The store manager gave Michael a small salary after being impressed by his perseverance and unwillingness to allow a dependable employee to burn out. "We can't let a good employee go just because life threw him a curveball," the manager remarked, offering a raise and flexible hours. Overwhelmed by the gesture, Michael showed him the updated timetable and discovered that the puppies, in an odd turn of events, had caused him to become more active in his community in an indirect way, creating relationships he would not have otherwise constructed. And after 6 months, the house that had been too quiet and desolate for 2 people was suddenly bursting with dog bedding, leashes, and live toys strewn all over the place. Despite being physically exhausted, Michael had started to have a difficult time converting his living area into a large dog park. Taking care of these animals and training them to be gregarious, well-behaved dogs gave him a new sense of purpose. He never would have imagined that loss would reveal a wellspring of resiliency and unshakable ethic of caring. Yet a pain persisted every time he remembered his wife and how he occasionally questioned whether she had any remorse because of how swiftly she had left and how readily she had written off the pups' lives, or whether she ever missed their earlier, more straightforward goals. But each time the desire threatened to guide him, he would gaze into the gullible eyes of a puppy cuddled in his lap and realize that grief had sent him down a spiral of resentment. Gave birth to an incredibly lovely family that, despite being unusual and labor-intensive, was unquestionably united by a common love and a determination to live through every victory. And despite this setback, Michael persisted without realizing that the true test of his determination and the pup's luck would not come for years. A test that would depend on his ability to maintain this makeshift family as the dogs grew into powerful, independent creatures. And in the months that followed his death, his own life changed in ways he never could have predicted. After his wife left, Michael fell into a risky pattern that was solely focused on the 10 developing puppies. Each day initially appeared to be similar to the one preceding early feeding at noon, cleanup following worker training, but underneath that routine rhythm, there was a persistent undertone of exhaustion and unusual kind of hope. He discovered that the small creatures he encountered were in uncharted territory, both logistically and emotionally. Were no longer merely defenseless patches of fur that they had promised to protect. They started to distinct peculiarities, complex tastes, and unavoidably a never-ending need for. Every hour became a battle between mischief and the dog's growing demands while juggling work at the neighborhood hardware store. If he stayed late to cover another employee's shift, he would have to return, which was a negotiation with tiredness. The pups would enthusiastically press against a living room covered in torn newspapers and a chorus of yips after midnight, against the temporary gate he had constructed from scrap plywood, longing for the affection and care they had been denied. He was humbled by trust, and even at his weakest, he was able to laugh quietly or stroke behind their ears and get a barrage of puppy licks in response, which briefly took away his loneliness. Even before his wife departed, his finances were not stable, but they soon became oppressing. The cost of puppy feed bags and veterinary visits for checks and immunizations was high. Sometimes he would find an envelope tucked under his store salary, which was just enough to cover the necessities. Anonymously placed a small amount of money or a gift card from the grocery shop in his front door. He was initially annoyed by the gesture because he didn't want assistance, especially not from the same neighbors who had called him insane for having so many puppies, but he finally gave in to feel thankful the pup survival was more important than pride. Made a mental point to return these favors in some way, even though he wasn't sure how or when, in an effort to bring. He started giving each puppy a thoughtful name, adding order to the chaos in the house. The puppies already had unique personalities, and giving them names seemed like a pledge that he would support them once they entered adulthood at midnight. When it came to unlocking cupboard doors, the darkest of the litter showed courage and amazing cunning, making Rosie smaller and more. A timid person who liked to take naps on Michael's lap whenever they could, Bruno hadn't. One by one, he became almost comically obsessed with carrying about an old tennis ball that he had discovered behind the couch. Such as Piper and Luna Milo, Daisy Scout Rangers, joined the roster, each capturing some uniqueness with a name. Each puppy transcended being merely accountability. They joined a new, albeit chaotic, family, and Alice was still challenged. Escalated rapidly, and with so many puppies vying for room, house training became nearly impossible. However, it appeared that no matter how frequently he took them outdoors, mishaps occurred all throughout the house. Various routines that removed half of the trash at a time, and then switched things up in an effort to cut down on sporadic mess. When he woke up one night, he saw that at least one puppy had broken through the makeshift barrier and was strewn all over the place with chewed junk mail. On especially sour nights, he would curl up in an ancient armchair and his hands, wondering if he was really prepared for this conflict. He missed the idea of working as a team. Have someone to split the workload with when his wife's tantrums or tears were too much. But the home stayed quiet save for the lively whimpers and squeaks of puppies that were dependent on him alone in spite of the. Over the course of a few weekends, he managed to say that he had enough stamina, yet moments of true joy pierced through the tiredness. Their first excursion outside the yard was a little stroll around the property with a small group of the pups. Wide-eyed wonder neighbors and an awkward dance of tangled leashes watched from behind drapes or stopped working in the yard, mesmerized by the procession of wagging tails and shaky steps that some of them took. Michael sensed a glimmer of hope every time he was near enough to give praise or a shy pat on a puppy's head. Instead of mocking him, someone showed the pup's kindness through these brief acts of compassion. Counterbalanced the persistent echoes of gossip, he met Linda, an elderly woman, on one of these walks she used to work for a dog breeder and lived a few blocks away. She exuded the composed authority of. After witnessing him manage 3 leashes simultaneously, someone who had raised numerous litters to healthy adulthood, she smiled softly. "You look," as she held one hand in his other arm, "like you could use a tip or two." She added in a pleasant tone that was half amused and half serious. That day, Linda, an ashamed Michael, acknowledged that he was completely out of his depth, accompanied him back to his cabin to demonstrate a few training methods, ranging from basic orders to gentle methods of. She even assisted him in rearranging the pups' sleeping quarters to help them unwind more and stop nibbling. For the first time in weeks, Michael took a little nap that evening in between activities. With Linda's help, the puppies established a new, steady schedule after 4 uninterrupted hours. In an attempt to learn more sophisticated training techniques that could prevent turmoil, he contacted a nearby dog obedience organization. Finding the time was difficult at bay as the pups grew. He frequently utilized his lunch breaks to look through adoption sites or make phone calls, but a part of him became extremely guarded whenever. Although others argue that finding separate families would be the wisest course of action, the idea of rehoming emerged. The idea of separating the puppies, who were essentially all he had, made him shudder. Remnants of the life he had originally imagined. But he knew in his heart that as the puppies grew older, the difficulties would only make it more difficult for him to raise a pack of 10 mature dogs in a small house with his partner's assistance. The question helped him, particularly on evenings when the emptiness of an empty bed pressed against him. He was grounded by the unfailing love despite the swirl of doubt. Every happy greeting at the entrance and wagging tail served as a reminder to him of the unwavering bond they had developed. Link that felt restorative in a way that no friend or counselor had ever been able to provide. If grief was a reflection of what he had lost, the puppies, who were living examples of how love could overcome heartache and create more fortitude than he believed was feasible, but the path ahead was paved with both practical and emotional minefields. Michael could feel the time passing when the pups would no longer be tiny. It readily contained a future in which the town's capacity for tolerance may be put to the test. Subtle gooing fear hinted that he might not yet possess the skills necessary to sustain this delicate balance. He always felt a calmness when he brushed his fingers over a puppy's velvety fur or saw one curled up trustingly at his feet. Determination propelling him ahead, he assured himself that he would keep constructing this odd but a devoted family that refuses to let heartache determine how their story ends. Michael was approaching the 4th year since his wife left, and he was caught between the 10 puppies were a fresh life he never expected and a reality he had once feared. He discovered that adult dogs had developed into strong yet devoted friends, each with their own distinct personality. Recognized firsthand how his house used to feel too tiny for his enormous dog family, and he had progressively modified the backyard to create a large play space with strong fence, shade shelters, and he frequently marveled at how far they had all gone despite the constant work, with a specific portion for training drills. Seeing the dogs every morning was a bittersweet way to experience this sense of progress. He felt a deep sense of gratitude when they came running up to him with wagging tails and shining eyes. Yet he realized that keeping up this huge pack by himself had become into a very monumental undertaking, and he'd outgrown the hardware store position in pursuit of a more lucrative and flexible work schedule, eventually landing a position in Despite being exhausting, the shift work at the local shipping warehouse allowed him chunks of daytime to spend with the dogs. And although the funds were insufficient to relocate to a bigger property, it maintained the veterinarian. Her shaky peace with the neighborhood had been established, but not finalized, with bills paid and the cupboard stocked with dog food. Without scars, the open animosity and rumors that had previously plagued him melted into cautious acceptance, particularly. Over time, people watched him after realizing his dogs weren't running a MCK or frightening the neighborhood, strolling the pack in smaller groups, with each dog obeying his directions consistently. Although it wasn't quite warmth, he had occasionally received a wave or nod from neighbors who used to avoid making eye contact. Was progress. He came to value these minor actions as indications that the animosity had subsided to acquiescence. Respect life, but managing 10 enormous dogs wasn't without its challenges. Every small thing had the potential to turn into a major problem, and one miscommunication could be as destructive as one dog. He ran the risk of rekindling his previous fears by jumping over an overly low fence or frightening a child with an unexpected bark. More vigilant than ever, thoroughly inspecting the yard perimeters every morning, double-checking gates, and carefully planning each dog's. While the dogs thrived on routine, Midnight preferred to work out in smaller groups so that no one felt overburdened. Michael was kept alert by Rosie Bruno, Daisy Scout Ranger Luna Milo Piper, and Odin. Ironically, the largest change was in their social hierarchies and peculiarities. Occurred when Marcus, a retired canine handler and local dog trainer, noticed. Marcus had heard of Michael's unlikely success for years and had initially written the man with 10 dogs off. Whether the narrative was a cautionary tale or an exaggeration, his curiosity finally prevailed, and he went to Michael's house. One weekend, He was shocked to discover a man in a basic t-shirt and faded trousers casually planning. Group recall, half the pack at once, with each dog enthusiastically and surprisingly disciplinedly answering Marcus' question about who had. Observed a lot of amateurs fail with fewer animals and understood that Michael's modest approach over the. Marcus became a rather frequent visitor during the following few weeks, giving Michael advanced training advice. Keep improving the dog's behavior. They practiced agility and group obedience, workouts utilizing easy-to-make hurdles, and, most importantly, socialization techniques. Dogs to prevent them from acting violently when Marcus or other unexpected visitors arrived. Gave Michael a fresh sense of hope since he saw a future in which his family might not only be accepted but possibly via therapy sessions they could benefit the community, or school volunteer demonstrations, of course, or any future-focused daydream, was restrained by financial constraints, despite the fact that the dogs no longer needed 24-hour care. Their feeding expenses were exorbitant, and 10 huge dogs' regular veterinary examinations consumed. The same pain of loneliness and heartbreak echoed in every spare dollar as he thought about the. With a companion at his side, he had originally planned his life, but over time, he had dipped a toe into the dating app world. But juggling new relationships with a dog-filled home put him at a drawback. While some potential dates were attracted when he described his 10 large dogs, many others lost interest. It was challenging to fit nights out around his feeding and training responsibilities, which frequently resulted in an early loss of control. Michael had been comfortable with them by the time the 5th year rolled around, but suddenly, "You won't believe who I ran into," an old friend texted him. "Your ex-wife was in town asking around about." As he raised the message, it shot a shockwave through his entire body. Dogs building a solid career and achieving some peace of mind. He had nearly ceased questioning whether she would ever come back. But now I'm feeling conflicted. Anger, anguish, curiosity, and a strange undercurrent of regret are all flooded back. Had she come to evaluate the outcome of her choice, what would she have wanted? To retrieve something she had discarded as his thoughts raced with inquiries, he kept his composure, telling himself that after 5 years of nurturing these dogs by himself, he owed no one an explanation, least of all for forming them into a dependable, devoted pack. He couldn't completely suppress the faint tremor in his voice when he told the woman who had placed him in their care, "Marcus, it looks like Mara's back in town. We'll see whether she comes here." Gave Michael a reassuring nod, reminding him that he had created an amazing life the very way she wanted it. The following afternoon, as the others relaxed in the backyard, Michael stood there throwing a frisbee to Bruno and Daisy. Over the fence line, in the shade, a person appeared momentarily hesitant, as if it was his wife, or more accurately, the person who used to share his dream, who mustered the bravery. The hounds pinched her, and she seemed older now, with somewhat narrower eyes that flickered anxiously for a breath. Their ears, unsure whether to wag their tails or bark, and then she spoke softly, feeling the weight of 5 turbulent years. Michael forced a breath as his name's syllable hung in the dense summer air. Years of pressure on that one moment revealed how far he had come since she left, as the proof unfolded in front of her. Like the powerful, well-behaved, and happy dogs of the Living Testament, a man wore. However, resolute, with a house that reverberated with intentional routines rather than meaningless misery, her gaze swept across observing the property's enhanced reinforced fencing, the training area, and the tidy dog toy piles. Her expression was confused by a mixture of surprise and a pang of regret. Yet she was still trying to say, or how he may react was still a mystery that lingered in the July heat. They stood apart, divided by years of unspoken words and offense. By the time the 5th year drew near, they were forced to face the reality of their former shared life. Had established a sense of security and predictability in Michael's home that would have seemed unthinkable when he initially discovered that he could no longer care for 10 newborn puppies by himself. The clumsy puppies that moaned all night or fell into their bowls have grown into powerful, self-assured adults. Friends, each having a distinct personality and a role in their improvised pack. Michael had developed into a caregiver with a measured approach to the once unreal responsibility of rearing a double-digit number of. Dogs by themselves had become a part of his everyday existence. He had even succeeded in establish a simple yet reliable program that balanced early morning feeding with shift employment at the shipping warehouse, and workouts, nights spent strengthening training, or just lounging in the yard with the dogs. As twilight approached, the neighbors who had initially foreseen catastrophe had largely come to accept this odd arrangement, some with a grudging tolerance, but others with a persistent suspicion that children from the next block would periodically congregate at the fence pointing. But Michael no longer felt like a pariah, and yelling repeatedly when they saw so many canines playing together. Halfway through that 5th day, Michael's parents recognized his obvious skill and offered to hire him to walk their own pets. Though, an unforeseen shock threatened to shatter the delicate web Michael had meticulously created. Got a brief but thrilling voicemail from a pal, just letting you know that when his wife returned to town, she inquired about you. The message left him speechless, bringing to light bitterness and memories that had lain dormant for so long. He had lived in a world where her name was never mentioned. He had forcibly cut off a piece of his past, but suddenly she was back, spanning 5 years. After abrupt estrangement, he attempted to continue his daily activities as though nothing had altered, although there was a hint of. His encounters with the dogs were tense. They could feel it, especially during a walk that evening. Piper, who had always been acutely aware of Michael's moods, lingered near him. She showed empathy by gently prodding his leg any time she sensed his pace faltering, which made him realize how deeply these creatures were his family and had taken root in his heart. Their continued existence is evidence of the life he led. After experiencing heartbreak, he spotted her while passing a few days later. When she passed his front yard in the early afternoon, seemingly inspecting the property, she seemed thinner then. Through the chain link, their eyes briefly met, and he recalled her silver-streaked hair at the temples. Fence that surrounded his property, but neither of them said anything. Daisy and Odin stopped their chase halfway around the yard. Their tails wagging unsurely as they gazed at the stranger outside. From Michael to the dogs and back again, the woman's eyes lingered, and after a tight heartbeat, she gave a little. Michael waved hesitantly and carried on walking that night, although his sleep was disturbed by restless anxiety. GW worries that she may have come to get the pets she had previously left behind or to cast out on his neighbors. She came back out of a late sense of regret, or was she just wondering if her assessments of Michael's failure had turned out to be accurate, and behind those inquiries lay another after everything he had suffered, after all that the dogs had meant to him. Was he required to pardon her, or even hear her explanations? His regular activities with the pack served as a form of therapy for his agitated feelings. Therefore, he intensified the regular routine that had become second nature, including morning playtime, extensive grooming, and health maintenance, and well-planned group walks that rarely involved more than 3 dogs at once too. By now, he had trained them to avoid crowding the walkways and frightening the neighbors. Basic commands to each dog, and some of them did well with more complex cues on. On weekends, he would sometimes take them in couples to a more sedate area of town, close to a baseball field that had been abandoned. Could run more freely during those ball-chasing and joyful leaping periods. Reminding Michael that not all life progress had to be measured in bank accounts was one of the joys of his week. Maintains a sense of approaching upheaval while striking a balance between social acceptance and escapable when he combed out Milo's thick coat on one of his calm evenings. Michael found himself thinking about his wife's reaction if she were to actually enter his property. Would she be, whether he was struck by the dog's self-control or surprised by their commanding presence? He recognized that a part of him wanted to show her his achievements, the puppy's growth, and his own development, but also another aspect stayed cautious, unsure that her presence would offer anything other than unpleasant recollections. His query was responded 2 days later in the late afternoon as Michael was talking with a neighbor at the fence over A. She was not passing by when she walked up the driveway to do some little fence repair. She was approaching with obvious fear, holding her hands together in front of her as if preparing for. However, the neighbor, recognizing the tension, graciously left Michael alone. The dogs who were sleeping close to the porch lifted their heads to see him and his wife face to face for the first time in 6 months. She whispered his name, her eyes maybe scouring the yard, her ears perked up to the underlying anxiousness in the air. She recognized each puppy by the faint recollection of a litter that was once so frail that they were enormous, and she inhaled something similar. To be perplexed by her tone, he nodded, uncertain whether to say something or remain silent. Ashtha. He couldn't help but look at her as he lumbered up to the fence with a look of curious assurance. Read her face, which was a mixture of astonishment, remorse, and possibly even admiration. I never thought this was possible. Her voice came out in a hoarse whisper, and Michael let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He said, simply put, neither did I during that pause in tension. Seemed to be the last balancing act, condensing 5 years into a few moments. The dogs in the yard, the new rituals, the previous pain, and everything else had brought us to this meeting were words. The future, albeit unclear, will be put to the test against lived reality. Because there was no denying at least one fact. The puppy she had abandoned had changed his world, establishing a tenacity and loyalty that they may not have anticipated. Following that first awkward encounter, there was a subtle tension in the air between the fence and the wife. Sarah backed off very immediately after she arrived, leaving Michael motionless as he struggled with the unexpected swirl of feelings of astonishment, lingering rage, and a nagging desire for bygone eras. The dogs hovered nervously close to the fence because they could feel every tremor in his voice and every little change in his posture. When she vanished from view, they turned back to Michael as if to protect him from more disturbance. Over the course of the following few days, he discovered curious tilted heads searching for guidance that he was unable to give right away. It's challenging to concentrate on daily tasks like feeding and grooming. Felt robotic, but the dog's constant love kept him steady every morning as they greeted him with bright eyes and wagging stories serve as a reminder of the life he had meticulously constructed thus far. He was unable to resist the growing doubt that Sarah would return, and if so, what more did she expect from him? Crucially, was there anything else he wanted from her, if anything? Appeared when a local reporter who had learned of Sarah's unexpected return contacted them with a request. Sought an interview because I was fascinated by the tale of a man who raised 10 puppies by himself. The reporter looked for a human interest story that contrasted Michael's seeming abandonment with the heartbreak of abandonment. Despite his initial hesitation, Michael experienced a brief surge of pride at the prospect of successfully establishing a new life. After giving it some thought, he reluctantly decided to publicly demonstrate the progress he and the dogs had made, wishing that the publicity would also help to allay any remaining concerns in the neighborhood regarding the dogs and his own. Later, the reporter showed up at his residence on a clear afternoon. A training exercise Michael had set up in the area, where half the pack was peacefully trotting. The reporter recorded every element of the backyard from behind the camera lens. Dogs obeying orders, leaping over easy agility obstacles, and steadfastly returning to Michael. The story that followed portrayed him in a sympathetic light, and his years of discipline and love were evident in his focus. How one guy recreated his world after being abandoned with 10 pups highlighted the daily obligation's natural capacity for mental healing, and how each wagging tail inspired him to develop resilience. The article swiftly went viral online in local communities, garnering both positive feedback and some jabs that said it was all too emotional or perhaps contrived. But Sarah's presence in the city persisted in the form of unspoken rumors. Nobody knew for sure why she had returned, with some assuming she regretted leaving in the. First of all, some conjectured that she had financial or personal reasons for. Days passed without a second visit to Michael's fence, and he was simultaneously trapped in an odd state of limbo, preparing a confrontation and struggling with interest in her motivations every time he took the dogs for a quick stroll down the peaceful back roads, looking at the sidewalks and passing automobiles in the hopes of seeing. When her figure reappeared, a few neighbors who had seen Sarah wandering around asked Michael. He could only shrug and mutter that he was unaware of the potential if she really planned to take back the dogs. wet at him more than he wanted to acknowledge that the dogs were unaware of the intricacies going on around them. Still insisting on Michael's constant attention, Bruno started to hobble subtly and needed veterinary care. Piper and Daisy, it's merely a sprain from a too eager leap, had a small argument one morning about a cherished chew toy, and Michael had to calmly step in to remind them of the. Even though these situations had previously seemed daunting, Michael managed them with P's hierarchy and peacekeeping. Every hurdle now highlighted the hard-earned mastery he had developed a confidence in with an almost natural flow that had developed gradually, one minor issue at a time. Emily Hahn, who continued to be a unwavering ally, provided a sounding board for Michael anytime he was unsure of how to respond to Sarah's reappearance over cups of. He expressed his mixed feelings while drinking tea at her kitchen table. On the one hand, he said, "I can't just slam the door if she wants to talk. However, she abandoned me and the puppies on the other day, and I can't allow her to upset the balance of the pack." Emily, reminding him that the decision was ultimately his, she listened carefully and remarked, "Maybe she's changed, but you're the." It is up to the person who endured all of this to determine whether or not she fits back into. As though inspired by these discussions, your next meeting with Sarah appeared out of the blue. Michael had left his property a few blocks away at midnight, and Luna had planned a brisk nighttime stroll about A. He froze when he saw her standing by a light post close to the ancient library, apparently waiting for him. Sarah's expression wavered between a range of emotions, including hesitancy and sadness, as she caught a glimpse of his astonished energy. Perhaps a hint of wonder conjured up a soothing tone he kept for calming the dog. Michael asked her whether she wanted. She nodded, and they started walking side by side while the dogs padded soundlessly in between them while they spoke. Was halting, full of her partial regrets and his partial acknowledgments. She talked about. She expressed regret for the harsh realities she had not anticipated and how she had followed her own restlessness to a distant city as. She looked at Midnight, who acknowledged her with a small wave, and I never imagined that tears would sparkle in her eyes. She started talking slowly, as if she was having trouble expressing how shocked she was by Michael's metamorphosis. Sarah hovered awkwardly as the dogs joyfully pulled toward home as the walk came to a conclusion close to Michael's gate. 1,000 questions danced as one looked from the cozy glow of the porch light to Michael's tired yet determined posture. It was unclear to them whether she was there to claim the dogs in order to make apologies or simply to. He offered her a simple farewell without criticism or invitation to ease her guilt, but she hesitated. Before turning away and pressing into the dusk, he said, "I'd like to talk again." With a whirl of relief, rage, and a peculiar heartbeat, Michael watched her shape disappear through the gate and disappear down the dark street. Of nostalgia swirled inside him, while the other dogs bounded up in the yard. Their unwavering acceptance and faith in him served as a reminder of the life he had battled valiantly to. With a gentle exhalation, he stood among them after building and sliding the lock behind him, conscious that, for once, this final act, whatever it may be, was still pending. If Sarah wanted to glimpse his life, he didn't feel helpless because he had moved past the sadness that had formerly defined him. She would find a man who, along with his dogs, had been chiseled out of hardship, had discovered a fortitude and love that undoubtedly surpassed her dreams, and that revelation he felt would be the actual pivotal moment in a narrative that had started with an abandonment and concluded with an. Over the following few days, the peculiar paused ceasefire between unbreakable bond and Sarah hadn't returned to the fence, but she and Michael had become a part of his already complex existence. Half expecting to see her silhouette against the setting sun, he found himself looking toward the road every evening. Rather, the sidewalk was deserted, putting him in a recognizable attitude of cautious expectation while the dogs listened to. His moods detected his sporadic diversion, especially Piper, who seems to observe his every activity with a serene, inquisitive look that seemed to be encouraging him to face his own erratic feelings. The routine he had so valiantly resisted to continue, but there was a faint tightness in everything he did when he got up in the morning to release the dogs into. While preparing their feed, he saw himself hesitantly looking around the yard for any movement on the horizon. Thought about how he may respond if she arrived unexpectedly and he invited her in to witness the illumination. To safeguard the delicate artifact he had constructed, she either left it behind or kept a safe distance. No matter how much he practiced, no response felt completely correct. During the week, a light drizzle transformed the yard into a patchwork of soggy earth and damp grass, ideal for a group of dogs who love playing in the mud on one such. Michael stood at the back door in the misty afternoon, beckoning the dogs inside one by one. Daisy proudly trotted in first. Notwithstanding the drips sticking to their fur, Milo followed their tails as they wiggled while carrying a hanging tennis ball at midnight. However, Bruno trailed behind, hobbling a little. Michael became concerned and knelt by the fence to examine Bruno's. Suffer a slight sprain, probably from jumping across uneven terrain. Remembered how, in the earlier days of their relationship, Sarah used to make fun of him for being too kind to animals. But that recollection now ached with a peculiar blend of silence and melancholy. Resolution. His phone buzzed the following morning with an unfamiliar number. After reading the feature, the voice on the other end identified herself as a coordinator from a nearby dog show. He was fascinated by his success in the article that highlighted how he had raised 10 puppies by himself. She asked him if he would think about displaying some of them in a demonstration or event in the area that would promote rescue. Michael initially questioned whether he would ever be aware of the importance of good pet ownership, considered putting the dogs on display in public, much less holding a protest. But the woman's argument was strong enough that it would be a relaxed setting with less stakes and more of a communal gathering, competition, and maybe he sensed that this may be the ideal platform to demonstrate the progress he and the dogs had made, particularly if some people who had previously questioned him might come after. He agreed to a contemplative pause and promised to bring a trained subset of the. Over the next few days, he spent completing the arrangements with Marcus, the retired canine handler who had been mentoring him, decided to assist together, and they selected 3 of the canines that would be most appropriate for a public gathering. Milo, with his mild disposition, Piper was always sensitive to Michael's emotional signals, and Scout, who excelled at agility exercises, but for pragmatic reasons, the others would stay at home. Michael felt a little guilty, ignoring them as though they should also be in the spotlight. But common reason 1 out and more than 3 might be too much for him in a crowded setting, as well as for onlookers who aren't used to seeing so many. He kept thinking about Sarah's return in the back of his mind, but he made an effort to. Marcus helped him focus by guiding him through weaving, brief obedience lessons, and display routines. Perhaps a quick fetch between cones could demonstrate how effectively the dogs responded even. He was teased about it when Linda, the sweet older neighbor who used to give advice on rearing puppies, stopped by with handmade snacks. Turning to become a local superstar, he laughed heartily at the idea that he was merely a man who had finally refused to neglect his obligations on the day of the family strolled as the event approached. A gentle breeze, carrying the aroma of fresh grass and cotton candy from surrounding food vendors. Wandering around looking in a local craft booths and rescue group stalls in a temporary arena surrounded by was fencing. A small group of people came to see the man with the 10 dogs, but that day, Milo trotted boldly at his left, Piper, with just 3 people in behind, remained at his right, while Scout occasionally padded behind him, looking about with vivid curiosity, even in the. Despite the commotion and music, the dogs maintained their concentration, demonstrating their patience. An instruction that had molded them. When Michael entered the ring, the microphone crackled with feedback, and there was a silence of. The audience's interest was piqued by the coordinator's brief introduction, which led into a straightforward, routinely telling Piper to lie down and calling Milo to heel, which sent Scout through a little obstacle course, and the spectators included skeptics from towns and wide-eyed out-of-town guests saw each dog's serene performance, with applause interspersed throughout the tiny accomplishments, every trick, and every display of trust between the handler and the dog on my chest fluttered with a warm pride as he recalled how stressful it used to be to tame even 2 puppies. As the demonstration came to a finish, he was amazed at how far his perseverance and everyday work had taken him. The crowd erupted in applause as kids rushed toward the fence to get a better peek. When Michael's parents nodded respectfully in appreciation, he had a rush of. Marcus received confirmation that the connection he had battled for was evident even to people who had previously made fun of him. Stood to the side, smiled like a happy relative, and gave him a shoulder slap while murmuring, "Well done." He saw Sarah poised at the edge of this small victory, her eyes sparkling with a feeling he, unable to name. She smiled tentatively, her hands clasped together. He had never seen her in a crowd before, her eyes following every motion Piper made as though enchanted had captured. He felt the triumph of the day take on a bittersweet quality as he balanced acceptance and caution. Observed that he had demonstrated his ability to the audience, but he noticed a nod of apologies, adoration, and perhaps regret. She finally came forward. She moved through the scattering spectators until she was just a few feet away from the makeshift ring, and their gazes locked in a charged moment outside his fence that brought back memories of that day. But this time the applause was still waning and the air crackled. Before he could say anything, she cleared her throat behind them and whispered, I never imagined seeing him like this." He just gave me an unsure, curt nod, whether to start a discussion or leave the dogs, who were gasping for air. Performance walked with him, Piper, whenever the emotional scales swung in her favor. Head between them, as though easing the strain for a while by bridging the wordless divide. Felt insurmountable, but Sarah turned away when she heard another demonstration dog howl in the distance. Pushing, she muttered, "You've done something incredible," and the silence that followed resonated with the pain of 5 years. Bewilderment and unexpected fortitude, even while there was no immediate remedy. Her tone of honesty suggested that she could have realized how much had altered Michael's perception of the dogs, and even the concept of what was conceivable subsequent heartbreak. The days after the dog presentation offered a peculiar blend of caution and uneasiness. Optimism, as the local population appeared to become more accepting of Michael, with some even congratulating him on a job well done. Sarah's return hovered in the air like charged static while he went about his daily activities with the dogs, but he was occasionally reminded by a constriction in his chest that something unresolved was only. Late one evening, after completing a final round of feeding and cleaning up his walled yard and silent house, he nearly let the phone go to voicemail when it displayed a number he didn't recognize, but his gut told him to. He swiped to respond to Michael, and although her voice was hesitant, it was definitely Sarah's. He paused before answering, preparing himself for the barrage of memories and lingering pain. "Yes," she let out the soft, hissing across the line. She inquired as to whether they might meet at a neutral location. Amid the din of dogs and the vigilant gaze of his neighbors, he paused, unsure what more conversation could produce. But in the end, he consented, if only to release. Several blocks away from the hardware store, they chose a small diner to relieve him of the weight of unanswered questions. He spent the following day at the store where he used to work in a quiet period between administering medicine to Bruno, who has acquired a minor limp once more, and assisting Frost with a new leash. Training method. His thoughts kept straying to the next meeting. He recalled how Sarah used to roll her eyes at him when he was being too careful with his budget. He now questioned whether his inclination for peaceful evenings over large gatherings had turned into an impenetrable divide, or had there been a more serious issue that caused their marriage to fall apart. The diner was just half full when he arrived, and he smelling of stale coffee and fried food. Sarah sat in a corner while both hands clutching a broken mug. She looked up as soon as he entered, her lips forming a quiet grin, perhaps observing the lines of fatigue he had accumulated over the years, the traces of single-handedly. He moved into the seat across from her, swallowing a puppy while he raised 10 boisterous dogs. For several excruciatingly long seconds, they both examined the growing wave of fear, the speckled surface of the table, and then she cleared her throat, saying, "Thank you for coming." She started off softly, and I can see that her voice was laced with an unusual humility. He nodded, allowing her words to linger. "You don't owe me anything, but I needed to see how you were, how they were." When asked about the dogs, he honestly stated that they were healthy, especially the one she had recalled by name. Actively creating a close-knit pack, Ash, Frost, and Willow had been essential in instructing the others to assume a position analogous to leadership within the group. He brought up Piper's talent for detecting tension. Bruno's recurrent limp portion of him sensed Milo's newfound confidence. It seemed strange to share such private information with the woman who abandoned them, yet every update on the dog's development also gave him a silent sense of pride, a subliminal declaration of what he had done. Her eyes glistened, and she dropped her eyes and said, "I didn't expect you'd preserve them all." Her voice caught. "I thought you'd give up or find." A refuge seemed unattainable, and he felt a twinge of resentment at her direct admission, but he forced it to go. Softly responding that he couldn't leave them no matter how impossible it felt, he replied as if they were family. That clarified everything, and she spoke when the discussion shifted into more awkward ground, haltingly of how she had felt confined by her financial difficulties, the sudden appearance of. Somewhere in her reasoning, she explains that she has fears about never wanting to struggle the way they did. Sadness in a W with bitterness, creating a story that, at the time, she felt justified her departure. But as she spoke, it was clear that regret was eating away at her. "I didn't think you'd," she reiterated, "still be there with them, as though that one thing were more important than everything else." Looking at his hands, he laughed without humor and said, "Neither did I. However, once I got going, I couldn't stop talking to them." They spoke for more than an hour while the sky outside deepened from orange to. Even yet, Indigo thought that the talk was more relaxed than either of them had expected. There was still an undercurrent of tension, and Sarah was reluctant to ask or accept Michael's invitation to see the dogs again. Push for anything, maybe not sure if her sporadic questions about if the dogs had cost him anything were appropriate. Possible joy, such as relocating to a larger house or forming a new connection, suggested a touch of remorse. He answered with measured candor, stating that although it wasn't simple, the sense of duty and unwavering affection he'd fostered with. "I won't lie that the pack had given him a purpose that was unlike anything he had ever known. He said that it didn't significantly alter my life, but I've come to terms with that." Eventually, they parted ways outside the diner. The farewell was muted under blazing neon lights, and there were no assurances of reconciliation, simply a mutual recognition that some healing had started with open dialogue. She gave a glimmer of hope that she could eventually be granted another opportunity to see the dogs. He nodded, but he wasn't sure if for her. She moved away, her shape contracting, wondering when that would ever seem natural. Later that evening, when the dogs welcomed him at the gate with their customary joy, he slumped onto the gloom at home porch, allowing them to congregate around him, each vying for a gentle pat behind his ears or a lick on his cheek. He considered the meeting's emotional cost and concluded that it had not been cathartic despite their warm and consoling presence. 5 years of abandonment could be undone in a single chat, but it felt like a first step in letting go of the hurt. The dogs, sensing his thoughtful demeanor, huddled closer as though to reassure him. Over the course of the following week, they continued to be a constant in his life, and the routine's calming effects returned. On a whim, Michael attempted to determine whether the silence meant a fresh storm or genuine acceptance. He went back to some of the things he had stopped doing when tragedy first hit, and he reunited with a coworker who invited him to a small event. And to his surprise, he ended up talking about subjects unrelated to puppy formulae or kennel improvements, and for once it seemed nearly normal. He realized that it's possible that the barriers he erected to safeguard the life he shared with the dogs also kept him apart from human company. Despite this insight, he continued to be loyal to K9, at least the kind that could coexist with it. Each dog's individuality had developed, and Piper appeared to be thankful for the relationship that had grown within his fence line. Midnight walked with serene assurance, more understanding than ever. Bruno's limp was less frequent, and Daisy had evolved from her youthful mischievousness to become a kind caregiver for the more nervous pack members standing in. He had no regrets about taking this route, even though it had cost him money, as he watched them happily sprawl out in the yard. Near the conclusion of that week, he reached half a decade of usual adult milestones. Sarah sent me a quick, unadorned text. "I know it's a lot to ask, but if it's feasible, I'd like to see them." Anticipation, he gazed at the screen for a long time, feeling deep within his chest. He considered the puppies when their eyes were only barely open, a mixture of past hurt and more recent cautious sympathy. He squeaked for warmth as he recalled how she had abandoned them, but he also remembered the tears she had shed at the diner. Putting his phone down, he sighed in calm wonder at what he had accomplished. Whatever was in store, whether it was a slim possibility for closure or a shaky second chance, he was only aware that the decision was his own, guided by the confidence of the dogs who had helped him deal with his heartbreak. Unqualified approval. During the course of the following week, Michael struggled with the echoes of Sarah's text twice. He typed a response, declining once with grace, agreeing gingerly, and then, every night after work, he would go out into the yard with his dogs and remove it before hitting send, hoping that presence would make his mixed emotions clear, but not a single look or, if nothing else, the humorous bark offered a straightforward response to the unasked issue of. With every peaceful sunset, the weight of allowing Sarah to return to their world increased, but the dogs persisted in occupy his days with the same routine and minor surprises that frost. And at sunset, Piper began to stand by the fence, looking into the forest line as if he were expecting someone. Maybe they believed that his restless animals could be incredibly sensitive to changes in their caretaker's emotional states, and although it had previously reassured him, it now seemed to serve as a reminder that his future was uncertain. A gap between the life he had created and the potential for his past to resurface when he eventually reacted to Sarah's text, although cautiously. They're doing well. He almost expected another sudden knock, but I'll give it some thought and let you know the hours after it was sent. On his door, but there was only a quick, "Thank you. Take your time. Next time" message. He worked, came home, fed the dogs, and took them on walks in small groups as he settled into a tense normalcy for a few days. In his spare time, he looked through his phone's random pictures of the puppies as little furry bundles, then as gawky youth, and ultimately as the powerful, self-assured canines they had developed into. He saw why it was so difficult to think of letting Sarah see the pets as the chronology developed. When she departed on a Friday afternoon, they had served as his anchor, symbolizing his survival and tenacity. Seeing the nervous, Emily unexpectedly dropped by with a box of leftover pastries from a neighborhood bake sale. Michael didn't immediately respond when she gently asked him whether he had decided on Sarah's request, causing a crease in his brow. Rather than giving Willow a treat, he approached her with cautious interest and eventually acknowledged, "I'm torn. Part of I want to show her and everyone what I've done, but I'm more afraid that she'll ruin our relationship." Emily, she advised that you set boundaries, so perhaps it doesn't have to be so black and white. She left you with, if allowing her to see them brings you or them closure, even if she may not have the right to ask for anything more, perhaps it would be worthwhile to investigate her remarks, which were realistic yet sympathetic in his. Though he wasn't sure if he believed in closure, he was aware of the feeling of unresolved business that. He texted Sarah once more on Sunday, suggesting that she visit his house in the late afternoon. He waited. Anxiety pricked him as Daisy and Scout hovered close to his ankles while he leaned against the gate outside for her arrival. He stood resolutely, reminding himself that it felt like 1,000 small needles. He was in charge of this encounter with the dogs, for better or worse. As long as he kept them near, his faithful friends would be secure. When she got there, she parked her car down the street and walked up with a look that was a mix of amazement and horror. At the gate, she stopped and looked at Michael, who only gestured for her to enter. Her eyes darted around a small agility course close to the back was flanked by pristine shoe toys. With several water basins in the shade and a fence, the area showcased 5 years of small upgrades at every turn, implying the amount of love and effort required to raise 10 dogs by yourself. I never would have thought that she would trail off her fingertips, grazing a robust pillar that supported the fence. Her voice wavered with a mixture of remorse and awe. You'd manage it, let alone thrive. He took a deep breath of calm appreciation, unwilling to be moved by her unexpected humility. Needed me, he said plainly, so I discovered what needed to be done every single day by. When the dogs got closer to some, Bruno put his nose to her palm and received a hesitant pat from Sarah, down to extend her hand to Piper, who sniffed it and then gave her a gentle prod of acceptance. For a brief period, only the silence was broken by the soft sniffs of the dog and the rustling of fur after a long time, and she appeared surprised that the animals displayed less aggression and more interest than fatigue at the distance. Her look briefly changed to one of remorse, as if she was wondering if these same puppies had previously muled. Ash stroked over the large crate she had left behind during her stay, powerless. She attempted to stroke him behind the ears while he was silently complimenting her and acting regal. But, reading her anxious energy, he recoiled backward. Something about that minor rejection caused her to swallow hard. Michael watched with tears in his eyes, caught between sympathy and a protective instinct for the dog that had kept him afloat. On the most difficult evenings, he allowed the silence to persist so she could come to her own realization that trust had been difficult to establish and could not be coerced as Sarah investigated the. She gently inquired about each dog's personality, closest friend, and any health issues they had encountered in the yard, peculiarities that distinguished them. He replied matter-of-factly, avoiding the emotional depth she had yet to discover. She noticed the tapestry of dedication he possessed, and the subtext was there in every little facet of everyday life. Stitched a tapestry with the pets that she had previously left behind, and they eventually came close to. It's lovely what you did on the ancient bench by the oak tree where she remained, spinning with unasked questions. She eventually succeeded. Are you pleased? He hesitated, unsure of how to sum up the past 5 years have been filled with heartache, laughter, tiredness, and unexpected pride. He said softly, "Peace, that's enough for now." She nodded and turned to face him. "I apologize," she said in a whisper, avoiding eye contact with the dogs playing in the yard. "I suppose I didn't think either of us could handle him, but you did in spite of the raw." Michael's tone was vulnerable, but she remained composed. "So you made your option." "I made mine," he said, gesturing at the dog's leaping end. This is the outcome of a slight sadness, as they play completely unconcerned by the emotional currents circulating around them. Crossed her face, and she asked him whether he had considered rehoming some of them, or if he intended to keep all 10 forever. He shook his head firmly believing that they are my family, and that we are set in our ways before departing. She reluctantly requested if she might come back, suggesting that they spend some time together on a quick walk with 1 or 2 of the dogs. After considering the request, he exhaled and provided the most straightforward course of action we could. He agreed, but he didn't promise or say no. She nodded appreciatively, her eyes shining with tears. Michael squatted in the grass as Piper and Milo ran toward him as she exited the gate by herself once more, eliciting a gentle giggle from his exhausted lungs about whether his wife's return would suspension or wither and remorse stayed in place. But as of just now, he had no. After 5 years of illusions, he had become a caregiver whose identity was entwined with these pets, should Sarah. She would confront a man who was no longer defined by the heartbreak she had left him with in an effort to regain that space, with a man who had found a capacity for love and perseverance through everyday acts of unwavering commitment that was far greater than anything he once thought to be feasible. A few weeks passed with no additional sighting of Sarah, and Michael thought the time was strange. Calming life resumed its regular schedule, with lunchtime meals and early dawn feedings. He would occasionally invite Marcus over for walks after work training sessions. For dinner, Orlinda would stop by to offer some vintage dog-rearing advice she had discovered in a long-forgotten notebox. If he gave Sarah any attention at all, it was merely to mentally dismiss the idea that her fleeting return was merely a brief moment of consciousness in which he was satisfied to. Waited until a courteous rap on the gate one gloomy day indicated that she had indeed returned. She was standing outside with a leash in her hand and a jacket on. When they attempted to walk the dog, they realized the collar was a memento from their early days as unintentional puppy owners. She had spent time going over parts of their life together, as evidenced by the youngest couple clinging to that damaged relic. After sharing, Michael paused for a time, allowing the drizzle to saturate his. However, something about her reserved demeanor and very soft knock eased the strain in his chest. Her eyes darted behind him as he slowly opened the gate, while maintaining an inclined posture to prevent the dogs from running out into the open area. Looking around the yard, "I hope we could go on the walk you indicated," she remarked softly, giving a little almost bashful. He gestured for her with a nod and a little smile, perhaps with 1 or 2 of them. At his whistle, a few of the dogs ran inside, and others were drawn to Sarah's strange aroma. Piper pressed closer to Michael than others. His ears perked up as he eyed the guest. Milo, who is usually curious, knelt down to sniff Sarah's hand. Michael discovered that the moment was surprisingly delicate as she allowed him to smell her. It seems unreal to see a dog that once represented everything she had left behind, now gently filling that need. After careful consideration, he decided to leave the others secure and take Piper and Milo for a quick drive around the neighborhood. As she fastened the worn collar upon Milo, Sarah appeared anxious, her fingers shaking. "I'm not sure if he remembering me," she said. "I don't know if that matters." Michael's tone was quite practical and neither harsh nor comforting. She said nothing further and quickly. They started the dogs off at a leisurely trot by his side, and she followed him a little. They followed a meandering path along. Late afternoon haze occasionally speeds by the quiet side streets. Recognizing Michael and his canines, she handled herself while they exchanged interested looks. Differently, less assured, and even unsure about how to act in a setting that was both familiar and unfamiliar to her. Dogs set the pace, sniffing lampposts and exploring bushes while periodically looking back for guidance. Michael and Sarah barely spoke, making brief comments about how tall some trees had gotten or how the hardware store had a new owner, and it felt more like two acquaintances than former partners were making courteous remarks, who had previously lived together, but even that mild change was surprising. From the stress that had burdened them as they went by the old diner, where she had abandoned him years before, only a street away. Sarah stopped at the bus stop after she had left town, saying, "I know I can't repair." She traced the faded sign of the diner and said, "What happened?" "I made that option, but as I stand here, I can see how things continue to go on without me." Appeared to be waiting for a rebuke or an indication of resentment. But Michael only shrugged and the dogs tugged at the leashes, prepared to. He said succinctly, "Continue exploring, life doesn't wait," and she swallowed, nodded, slipping back into his footsteps. The trip lasted just 30 minutes, but by a subtle thaw had broken the ice barrier between them by the time they got back to Michael's gate, and she paused at the fence, gave him the collar back while waving the dog's tail and saying, "Thank you." As if anticipating a next step, Michael looked back and forth between them during the enjoyable outing and provided a curt. He replied, "Goodbye. Thanks for stopping by." And she even opened her mouth as thought to add more, but shut it again and turned away. The moment felt like a minor one, neither definitive nor unresolved. Triumph over the weight of animosity that had before seemed insurmountable in the days that followed. She intermittently texted, usually quick updates, such as a peek at old pictures she found in a dusty box or a few remarks on how. He said in a single line, not rude but cautious between sentences, the town felt quieter than the city she'd lived in. They were separated by 5 years of heartache and untold tales, creating a barrier that neither of them could overcome with courteous conversation alone. However, every sporadic interaction established a layer of tentative trust, while under Michael's watchful eye, the dogs kept growing, and Piper shocked him by learning a difficult retrieving technique. Selecting particular goods by name and handling them carefully. Bruno's limp improved as a result of modest Marcus suggested physical therapy for Mello, even for the more distant dogs. Late one evening, Michael was soaking up the calmer mood that had replaced the earlier months of stress. Looking at them lying happily on the porch and remembering the gloomy uncertainty that once dominated the whole. The experience of raising 10 puppies by themselves felt like proof of a more profound reality, as did their constant commitment. May repair cracks that once seemed irreversible. Months slipped into a mild autumn, illuminating the town's trees in. Sarah's occasional trips to walk some of the dogs become a quiet staple of certain afternoons, but they didn't quite reach the warmth of true friendship. Instead, maintaining a functional courtesy, she became familiar with each dog's name and peculiarities, occasionally grinning nostalgically as she recalled the first days when the puppy's eyes were barely open and they were squeaking. Michael allowed her to say neither. She was neither urged nor restrained to adhere to a tenuous agreement that allowed the dogs to define their newfound contact. As always, the dogs showed a level of acceptance that human hearts frequently fall short of, which is unavoidable for neighbors. Seeing the shift, Rumors were circulating that she might be considering moving back in, or that Michael was gentle enough to keep her at bay. He ignored the talk that no. There had been a severe breakdown, if the continued kindness was any indication, was that the 5 years he had spent traveling with his dogs could not be changed by the opinions of others. They were the only ones who had seen the nights of crying fatigue and the steadfast devotion that triumphed over hardship. After another quick stroll in the afternoon, Sarah inquired rather casually, "Do you ever wonder about?" There were practical benefits to rehoming some of them, but the expense and space, the demands, but they also recalled the previous abandonment he had us handle. "They're not some problem to fix. They're my family," he said curtly before forcing a gentler tone. She bent her head. I didn't mean that she closed herself off, but I guess he didn't detect the sadness in her gaze. He only gave her a mute response as she pushed limits in search of a position in this world that she had previously rejected, courteously saying goodbye with a polite nod, even though daily duties stayed the same. How long could these shaky visits go on before ending in a confrontation? Michael sensed the faint drum beat of a question. Given their history, the dogs might tolerate her presence in moderation, but would they detect resentment? If remorse lurked beneath her exterior, they had become aware of human conflicts. In particular, Piper observed Sarah with a kind yet perceptive gaze, as if she were waiting to determine whether she actually belonged or was but a transient figure moving through the strands of their individual stories once more in that unpredictable environment. Paths gradually started to establish a pattern of careful reconnection, balanced by the strong loyalty that Michael had cultivated. Whether their story would lead to a new understanding or drift back in a distance was still up in the air in his pack. Question overshadowed by the resolute presence of 10 loyal friends who, having arrived at defining Michael's life in a block of 10,800 words the slow, Sarah's visits had a tentative rhythm that hovered around an unstated balance. She would show up on specific afternoons are typically spent walking 1 or 2 dogs around the block or down a local trail, though this is not always the case. Before she slipped back outside, each session concluded peacefully with the leashes returned and a polite farewell. These interactions were a risky trade-off for Michael and an opportunity for her to witness the life and the dog she had previously left behind without giving her the authority to destroy the security he had. Despite fighting for more than 5 long years, their tense ceasefire trembled beneath the surface of the few words they exchanged. They had a tense emotional discussion, and he saw glimmers of sadness in her gaze whenever she saw the shabby furnishings and damaged dog toys. That attested to his individual struggle, which she appeared to be struggling with. Her comments about how serene the yard seemed, or how amazing the dogs looked frequently evoked feelings of guilt and an ill-defined desire, concluded with an incomplete statement, suggesting that she was unsure of how to quickly close the gap between remorse and admiration. Sarah quietly suggested a bolder step in the afternoon while the yard was encircled by swirling autumn leaves. She inquired if they could go on an excursion in the woodland preserve just outside of Town Surprise with all the dogs. Yep, the entire pack. In order to manage 10 mature dogs in a public setting, Michael paused his rake mid-sweep chest height with contradicting reactions. Was no minor accomplishment, particularly when dealing with someone whose dependability he doubted. But the request also affected a grudging hope, since he had put up with the notion that his dogs were threats or that the arrangement was destined to fail. Maybe witnessing the pack in its prime, roaming freely in a secure. After considerable consideration, he decided that establishing a specific area could be a minor win for both of them. Conditions: they would keep half of the dogs on leashes at all times, utilize the preserve's most remote trails, and plan. Sarah complied with his requirements without protesting, seemingly happy that he hadn't bluntly rejected. Michael took it upon himself to arrange the arrangements over the next few days. He also decided to provide each dog name tags and extra leads portion water, bring Emily along to assist with the dogs, and to make sure that someone else was there in case of conflict. Sarah was awakened by a pale sun that sent a watery shimmer across the sky. Appeared more like the sensible but slightly subdued woman he had known in the past, dressed in a flannel shirt and solid boots. They caravanned to the forest preserve, a rural region surrounded by tall pines. where Emily joined them in her little hatchback. Twisting dirt roads and the silence of an area mostly untouched by the bustle of the city. The dogs excitedly whined as they were loaded into crates and leashes because they felt like they were going on an adventure. As expected, disembarkation was chaotic, with Ash yelling commands at the younger dogs and Piper running to welcome newcomers. Bruno sniffs tiredly as he scans the strange clearing, but beneath Michael's. With Emily's deft help and an authoritative voice, the gathering divided into pairs. Some are on leashes, while others alternate between being on and off the lead for brief periods of time. Sarah watched as they stepped more into the forest, the pine needles beneath their feet and the fresh air filling their lungs. I'm amazed at how the dogs moved with calculated assurance as they scent the trail at a midnight truck close to the front. When Elle strayed from the walkway to explore a rustling bush, Daisy lingered close to Michael's side, returned dutifully at a whistle. Willow and Milo, who were more watchful due to nature, stayed near the group. As for Ash, he kept a watchful posture in the back, seemingly protecting them all, and periodically gave Sarah a knowing look in. The dog's familial bond and respect for Michael were evident halfway through the trail, demonstrating that unspoken dynamic. Arrived at a clearing with a tiny creek winding through it, reflecting golden sunlight. Michael allowed the dogs to swim around with joyful abandon, understanding from experience that a little freedom too, observing from the creek bank, kept them interested and content as they explored new senses. Unshed tears sparkled in Sarah's eyes, and I never imagined seeing them so happy. "Aren't they nearly like a family, Michael?" she said. "They're a part of something bigger than just a house or a yard." The phrase family made me uneasy, but I couldn't deny that the dogs had filled that. Encouraged by the laid-back mood, Emily quietly excused herself to investigate a spot in his mind that he had thought was unoccupied. Side trail, briefly separating Michael and Sarah, the sound of rushing water and the dog's amusing yips supplied a soft music, and Sarah looked at Michael and said, "I'm sorry, Ernest." Remarked a little shaky, "I know it's too late to reverse what I did, but it's very different than what I had in mind when I went because I thought raising." He took a deep breath. "It was impossible that we'd ruin ourselves trying to cope, but you built this life." It was difficult for him to deal with an avalanche of unsaid hurt and doubtful hope. Said in a low voice, "But we made it through, and I'd like to think we did better." He looked at the happy lulling of the dogs' tongues following a vigorous run they had taught them. Resilience is the ability to persevere over difficulties or the opinions of others. "Impossible," she nodded sadly and faintly, tears forming in her eyes. After a period of stillness, she posed a question that had been bothering her for weeks. "Is there any space for me in any of this?" The clear air like a burden reverberating over 5 years of remorse. Michael gazed at her, trapped between the memory of her sudden exit from the lonely and the pang of memories. Nights, the crippling obstacles, and the brutal compassion that acknowledged her. "I'm not sure why, but," he said, at last, voice low, "they're my life now, and I won't jeopardize their stability if you want to come visit occasionally to watch them age and perhaps assist me with them. But I've changed, and so are you. It can't be what it was before." He paused and exhaled. She let the tears fall from the corners of her eyes, but she didn't object. She looked across to the dogs playing by the creek, letting them speak to the potential future, one characterized by a careful readiness to restore confidence, even if it takes some time and involves different conditions, rather than by broken promises. Bruno, who had strolled up to look into the emotional tension, accepted her touch as she reached down to pet him. Completely certain, but not dismissing it, either Emily came back soon after noticing the muted tone and indicated that it was time to continue as the group collected the dogs and made their way back toward the cars in a more subdued manner. Tension was still present on the fringes of the talk, but it was overpowered by a sense of friendship that surrounded them. Expressed relief that the day had gone smoothly and that the woodland had embraced. They were gently guided into the next unsure step by Michael's serenity, which raised the actual question of whether he could forgive, or if he even desired a partial reconciliation, was still unclear. Yet in that brief silence of twilight sensed a tentative glimmer of peace 5 years ago as they packed the dogs into crates for the journey home. He stood among a family of dogs he had raised, from defenseless puppies to self-assured adults, when heartbreak had seemed insurmountable. Zara's return could make that more difficult. Adults are a monument to what unwavering love could accomplish. Reality, but it might not be able to sever the already formed relationship, become a part of a new chapter in which she witnessed a life that was changed by perseverance and unwavering affection, as Michael and Sarah cautiously led them through the woodland preserve parking area as the cold dusk fell. After the afternoon's play, Emily hovered close to the dogs as they returned to their crates, each of them panting happily, providing discreet assistance and sporadic smiles, but understanding that the last discussion needed to take place. Between Michael and Sarah, the animals gradually took up residence in their own areas. Stories. The two were standing at the open trunk of Michael's SUV, wagging at the prospect of a dinner and a cozy place to relax at home. When ex-spouses hesitated, the illusion of only one more walk vanished, ending the forest adventure. Had gone better than either could have imagined, with only cooperation and no disorder or violence. Sarah's eyes glistened with that now familiar training and a glimpse of the relationship Michael had developed with the canines. She glanced at the group of dogs, recognizing each one from Bold Ash to Gentle Willow, with a mixture of grief and adoration. Appeared to be evidence of her 5 years of unwavering commitment. She said initially, voice muffled, "I want to express my gratitude for allowing me to participate in that today." As she pointed to the boxes and the dogs, she said, "I know I don't deserve it after leaving you with all this permanence around them, so I suppose a part of me needed to know that they were all right." Michael, who had been silent all afternoon till he eventually let out a breath. "They're my world now," he muttered. "It took some time to arrive, but they are okay." His tone was neither kind nor harsh. For a minute, he remembered, it was more of a statement of fact supported by years of grit. His early days spent with the abandoned puppies, the fatigue the nights endured, the debilitating squeals, dread that he wouldn't be sufficient now that he was facing the woman who had before written off those same animals as uncontrollable. Burden, that minor detail heightened his vigilance, and they are now looking for. The doubt that had persisted since her return was somewhat resolved, but it was also like a wedge tearing open old wounds. She started by revealing a new level of honesty. "We've gone on a few walks and I've seen a lot. Once more, I'm not sure what would have caused her to tremble and break off her hands. I'm even requesting that I simply observe the life you've built and how it has transformed you. I'm amazed at how you've altered them, Emily, and I can feel the last twist in the." Discreetly offered to wait by her own car so that the two might have some solitude once she went away from the silence. The forest's dark silence crept up around them, pressing closer to emphasize the significance of the words that would. I understand that Michael's voice wavered less than Sarah's when he spoke. Though it's a lot to process, I can't change the years that passed or the moments I was. The heartbreak was alone himself with them when he looked at the sleeping dogs in the crates. They sort of dragged me through. Sarah's mouth squeezed into a somber line, and I knew she couldn't or wouldn't. I told myself, you'll never manage that I was saving, and seeing them thrive underscores what I gave up. Her eyes wandered the yard while I struggled in despair, never imagining this. The leashes were neatly wound around the assortment of dog toys in the well-organized boxes. Was a picture of a guy who, in addition to surviving, had effortlessly turned pain into a living testament of commitment. Sarah's hair danced on her face as I swept through the rustling pines. "Won't push," she added quietly, her gaze darting between him and the canines I recognize. "I can't just go back in and act like I'm involved, but if it's okay with you, I'd like to be present in some way too. Observe them to see you, and perhaps to determine whether we can rescue any threat of." Realizing, he inhaled deeply in the hopes that Piper Daisy and the others had. Here to the loneliness that had threatened to engulf him so long ago. Did he owe her an opportunity to see the life? He considered whether his devotion to the dogs required that her presence be kept strictly to a minimum. Neighbors marveling at the emotional toll of seeing someone they had so casually abandoned again. Everything, and after some thought, he came up with phrases that felt genuine. "Look, I'm willing to allow you to visit and spend time with them if they feel comfortable doing so, and if we can work things out. Regardless," he stopped there to look at the dogs, "but don't expect me to just It will take some time for them and me to trust you. So forget about 5 years. Sarah's nod was, I'll respect that, she whispered as she waited with relief and sadness. The silence that followed buzzed with unspoken regrets that might never completely mend the aspirations of old wounds. That may never happen yet. Yet for once the silence did not feel so dire. Their eyes locked in a silent pact. To hesitantly attempt to create a new dynamic using the remnants of a broken marriage and a pack of dogs that. Emily returned to them with her hands stuffed in her jacket pockets, looking at their faces with a wary smile. She queried gently, Everything okay? Sarah nodded slightly. Michael exhaled a final breath as she embraced herself against the chill. I think we've come to an understanding, he said, stated, but shortly after they split up, it was unclear what form that understanding may take. With a quiet wave, Sarah got in her car and drove off along the gravel road, her tail lights fading. Behind Michael and Emily in the peaceful forest preserve, the dog woke up from their sleep with some stretches and Michael ran a palm over the closest crate, where Piper's warm eyes were, while he yawned, unaware of the seriousness of the conversation. I guess it's time to go home, he muttered quietly as they looked at him through the bars. The journey back was quiet yet serene, partly because of the dog and partly because of him. The tightness in Michael's chest subsided and was replaced by a cautious serenity that would never take away the hurt of being abandoned. 10 defenseless puppies. Yet instead of carrying a raging grudge, he felt silent appreciation for. He had created a second family with those dogs, whose steadfast devotion had taught him a different kind of strength if tomorrow presented fresh difficulties, such as neighbors' quick doubts, or perhaps a slow, uncertain road to reconciliation at the time. But he had to overcome greater obstacles than he had triumphed in more significant conflicts. Even though Sarah's remorse hung over their shared memories like a ghost. The pack was all the evidence Michael needed to know that, with perseverance and a strong will, his life had already found its anchor. Little love impossibilities could become commonplace miracles in spite of. The specter of unresolved tension persisted, waiting for the smallest spark, despite the cautious ceasefire Michael and Sarah had struck. Sarah continued to drop over sometimes for a few weeks, each time spending a little more time in the yard. When Michael would periodically take the dog for a quick walk, their interactions were courteous, some may even say amiable, but there was a nagging sense of disquiet throughout the towns. The rumors had subsided, but there was always a whisper that she was trying to re-enter his life, or was just trying to calm the brewing uneasiness in her conscience. One chilly Saturday afternoon, when it was eventually released, Michael was frantically rushing to the small dog park on the eastern shore when he received an unexpected phone call. He rarely visited the edge of town due to the possibility of turmoil with so many dogs that day, but he had consented to meet Sarah there, who had requested permission to try out 2 of the dogs, Bruno and Willow, in a controlled. After much consideration, Michael had given in to the environment that promised close supervision, but only. When Michael arrived, the scene was all over. She had called him minutes into her visit, upset that something had gone wrong. A small group of people had collected behind the chain-link fence in a frenzied manner, and Bruno stood close by, obviously worried, while Willow shivered and cowered against a bench. The gate hackles were slightly risen. Sarah crouched a few yards away, her face heated with anxiety when she saw a man in a bulky jacket got into a heated argument with someone who seemed to be a park volunteer, and the dog almost leaped at my child, shouting. The volunteer attempted to soothe Bruno by scolding him, but the tension splintered like static electricity. Michael's chest constricted as he hurried into the gated area, looking for any indications of Bruno's violence. Willow was obviously frightened since she lacked the snarling and tooth-baring posture of a real attack. With his tail tucked, he grabbed Bruno's collar and whispered a soft order. Sarah watched as the dog leaned nervously into him and gave out a low whine that seemed more like fear than rage. She seemed scared and regretful, as if she regretted bringing them here. The man in the bulky jacket frowned at Michael's calm but anxious question. Your dog? Frightened my child, who rushed straight at him. I'm not sure what may have occurred if I hadn't pulled my son away. Sounded certain, yet there was a hint of exaggeration from a silent bystander. Saw that Bruno trotted over, possibly just to look at the child's sudden attempt to pet Willow. With a faltering voice, Sarah attempted to clarify that they had been playing fetch on one side of the cage when the toddler ran around a corner, and the chaos quickly got out of control, making the father think Bruno was attacking. Michael's eyebrows furrowed as he heard the barrage of charges and defenses. He realized how quickly fear might turn a straightforward misunderstanding into a conflict that could damage the... Michael turned to the irate father and said, "Please, entire pack again. I'm sorry your youngster was scared of my dog." With all the compassion he could muster, is cautious without being hostile. He has never attacked or bitten anyone. He checked Bruno by sliding a hand along his. Willow winced behind the dog as she felt its pounding heartbeat. Tension was released as Sarah stood unsurely in the background, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. A young boy clutching his father's pant leg came out of the crowd. Even though the tear streak didn't seem physically hurt, he looked at Bruno with a mix of infantile and lingering anxiety. He said, "Curiosity, it's big," and pressed his face against his father's side. The father scowled. "Keep your animals under control if Michael is still acting dangerously." The guy and his youngster were then taken out by a park volunteer who encouraged them to lodge a formal complaint if they thought. As they went, Michael shakily breathed and checked Bruno's collar and urged Willow out of her corner. He glanced at Sarah's face. "I apologize." She was pale as she tried to touch Willow's quivering shoulder. "I messed up," her voice as she whispered that we were only trying something new. Michael paused, struggling with a flurry of regret, fearing that this would ruin everything for you. With a hint of sympathy and release from fury, he said softly, "We'll work it out. Leashes to both dogs, but this is precisely the reason I've been so watchful." Miscommunication, and others portray them as villains based on his remarks without explicitly. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard as she realized how much the blaming had hurt her. In a place that still remembered her desertion, the line between acceptance and judgment was brittle. Only a few staircases remained after people who sensed the drama had subsided drifted away. Michael led Bruno and Willow out of the dog park, unsure of whether to provide consolation or pass additional judgment. Sarah silently followed him into the safety of his SUV when the dogs were buckled up. "I'm glad you tried, but next time," she said calmly but firmly. "Before making a decision like this, obtain my opinion. We can't risk them being classified as dangerous." Her eyes glistened, and she nodded. "I wanted to assist to demonstrate that I could contribute, but I realize how naive I am." She whispered it quietly, and they parted ways in a quiet silence before Sarah climbed. Michael stood by his tailgate chest tightly as she poured tears into her own car, threatening to spill over. The aftermath of that fear served as a sobering reminder of how quickly everything may fall apart due to a single grievance or worried parent. Dismantle 5 years of relentless work. Even after the initial panic faded, a greater understanding emerged that desiring to reconnect was one thing, but the dogs also required unwavering stability, not a half-hearted approach, while incorporating her into this dangerous life. Efforts that could endanger them. That evening, in the solitude of his tiny living room, Michael sank into the faded. He combed through the day in an armchair with the dogs that had taken up their normal positions at his feet or next to him. Happenings, feeling both relieved and sad. Even though nobody was harmed by the brush with, he was shaken by the encounter and looked at the scratched coffee table, recalling how she had abandoned him with 10 newborn puppies and was amazed with their progress. Perhaps tomorrow would present a novel issue that tested his relationship with these canines or Sarah's ability to adapt, but the only thing he knew for sure was that his devotion and unrelenting concern for these animals would not be compromised by anyone else's time frame or remorse. He eventually got up and turned off the lamp as midnight drew near, and he walked the entire length of the sound of canine paws follows a silent retinue of devotion along the corridor. Tomorrow would be another day of working, eating, training, and facing the outside world. He was still hesitant to accept the unlikely family he had created, but he would confront it with the unwavering support of the 10 hearts that had sustained him during his darkest moments. And if Sarah so desired, sharing even a tiny portion of that love would be done in a way that respected the wonder and fragility of what. Even today, after 5 years had gone by since Sarah's departure, Michael could still remember the hollow echo in the The solitude that followed her leaving their tiny living room had been debilitating, but he wasn't. Alone with 10 defenseless puppies that whined and moaned for what little warmth and food he had left. Every day's sunrise brought fresh calls for food, new messes to clean, and new reasons why he should spend time moping over betrayal or heartache. Couldn't just give up since he had made the decision to not let those people down, whether it was out of obstinate pride or pure devotion. He gradually rebuilt his life from the ruins of his marriage, creating. During those first several months, he developed a bond with the dogs that seemed unlikely to be broken. Constantly cleaning, feeding, and soothing 10 quickly developing puppies consumed all of his time and money. While acquaintances and neighbors said he would give in and turn the puppies over to a shelter, persevered. Each pup acquired a name, a personality, and a position within the developing pack. Dynamic that Michael loved and handled. The hardware store's limited budget made him accept. Working extra hours to get enough cash for veterinary costs and limitless supplies of. The needs of those tiny yet inquisitive souls that occupied the space overpowered the comfort of puppy chow sleep. Once, there were lonely nights filled with squeaks and lively tussles. Yet despite all the hardships, small victories shone in the everyday habit, such as when the puppies first consistently arrived when called, or when they risked their first few brief walks without fearing oncoming vehicles. Every small victory stoked a glimmer of optimism in. The puppies were living evidence that Michael might recover and that he hadn't fallen apart under the strain of. Over time, attitudes about abandonment started to change from mockery to admiration, or reluctant acceptance. But Michael's strict routine and unfailing love changed a ostensibly chaotic circumstance into a functional, albeit unconventional, family buy. He had adjusted to a new job in a shipping warehouse that paid a little more by the time the dogs were full size. Even though the house felt small, he had somewhat flexible hours to keep his dog pals in a steady atmosphere. He transformed the backyard into a roomy training and play area with strong fencing and custom agility equipment. His days were a tapestry of meticulous attention to detail, including preparing specialty foods, brushing thick coats, and, to avoid crowding the sidewalks with more dogs than the neighbors had previously anticipated, each group of dogs was rotated for walks. Turmoil or a wave of dog assaults. They were amazed by the pack's increased discipline. And then suddenly, when Sarah came back to town, his initial impressions of her were brief, a hazy wave along the fence or a hesitantly approaching on one of his outings. Tension flared any time she was in close proximity to the pain of 5. Waring, years away, was mildly interested in hearing what she had to say at. He first kept their talks brief, and she later admitted that she regretted underestimating him and believing the. Neither of them imagined that their disclosures would erase the years of hardship that came with having 10 puppies. He had endured loneliness, but the candor marked the beginning of a cautious thorough, despite the feeling of. Michael had become extremely protective of the life and the dogs that had survived him, yet the precariousness persisted. It was heartbreaking to let Sarah return, even for a quick walk or to assist with small chores. It was like giving a frail heirloom to someone who had previously thought it was useless. But as she went more frequently, obligingly offering to walk 1 or 2 of the dogs, he saw that she handled the leashes with genuine amazement, gently fumbling through recollections of the puppy's early years and appearing quiet whenever she noticed how large they had become, so powerful that a single mishap at a dog park almost rekindled the towns. When a terrified parent accused one of his dogs of being aggressive, previous concerns were dispelled, leaving a. Michael was relieved, but drained by the vivid reminder of how fast tensions may flare if any slip-up happened in public. Discover renewed determination to keep the dogs under close supervision and well socialized. He wouldn't let fear or half-truths. After years of work, Sarah's CED is at the fringe, doubtful but persisted. Their first halting discussions turned into more in-depth discussions about the peculiarities of the dog and the. Michael had made small changes to the house and yard, and she could see how the mayhem caused by 10 puppies had grown into the pains of her regret in a disciplined yet energetic kennel of dogs. Became evident in the way she lingered on minor details about Bruno's once ungainly gait and how it now carried him. confidence, or how Piper devotedly observed Michael's every action, something Sarah had never thought dogs were capable of. Muster when, at last, she requested to take all of the dogs to a nearby forest preserve, a move that put. Because Michael was prepared to give her a chance, she saw an even more amazing sight, the pack moving as one. She gasped as the well-practiced troop crossed the boundary between tamed and wild. How Michael's stern orders and the dog's instant, eager obedience in that silence of tall pines revealed fed. When she acknowledged, "I couldn't have foreseen any of this from Michael each," her voice caught. It felt like a complex dance, half wordless, part ancient grudge, to walk by her side, yearning for resolution and a somewhat muted sense of satisfaction in his accomplishments. Even if no single discussion could make up for the heartache she caused by leaving, the politely deliberate pace of. He was able to demonstrate to her how love and patience work on his terms after she was reintroduced. Her unwavering commitment has fashioned a life full of dog love in. There was neither a final sentencing nor a grand, spectacular reunion at the end. Instead, they wandered toward a tense understanding. Sarah realized she no longer had any legitimate claim to these canines while, through a chain, Michael allowed her to witness snippets of the discipline and commitment that had saved him from despair. Link fence, or while taking a little, supervised stroll in the gentle twilight of it. When asked if he regretted spending 5 years on an unlikely mission, Michael expressed an emotion that may be described as acceptance. Would merely shrug and gesture at the dogs that were either bouncing ahead of him in the yard or gently sprawled across his feet. With a serene conviction that no critic could deny, he would say, "Need me." Despite all the expenses, fatigue, and heartache, he had created a life that no one else thought was feasible, demonstrating beyond doubt that the greatest leaps of faith can occasionally come from periods of abandonment, as demonstrated by Sarah, who once considered the matter as hopeless and could hardly believe what she saw when she saw the tender devotion, and Michael could have hoped for the physical evidence of the pack's serene strength, which ultimately proved to be the greatest triumph. That the unlikely can become commonplace, and that everlasting love can mend a broken vow, with sufficient bravery, perseverance, and a strong will to finish.